Welcome to Creating Community, part of the podcast series about the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, a professional network of grant-making practitioners referred to as AGAG. This podcast series is part of the AGAG Legacy Project that documents its contributions to philanthropy. In this episode, we learned what prompted the formation in 2000 of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. We learned about the people, discussions, and practices that shaped its evolution. Through their own words, grant-making practitioners share anecdotes about their involvement over the years, the conversations that influenced them, and the experiences that were part of creating a community. In 1990, after serving 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was finally released. This event signaled the end of apartheid, the institutionalized system of racial segregation and white supremacy in South Africa that affected the entire Southern Africa region. South Africa's transition from an apartheid government to a democracy changed relationships of all types and at different levels between civil society and government, and with the American foundations that had been active in the region. A group of these foundations formed the Southern Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. Referred to as SAGAG during the 1990s, this group encouraged support to communities in Southern Africa and their efforts to combat apartheid. In the post-Mandela era, the role of American foundations changed, as did the landscape of American philanthropy. A new network emerged in 2000, the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. This group took a big tent approach to bring together American foundations funding across Africa. Its emergence was viewed as a welcome addition to the Africa funding landscape. Gerry, who at the time was working for an American foundation with offices in South Africa, reflects on how he viewed the new group.
This was a very big transition period in South Africa, right? And I think the way the funders that existed prior to this new dispensation and the ones who came after had to kind of settle in and begin to see what they could do together and collectively. And there was this kind of very elitist that stay in, the program officers that were funding in South Africa would stay in very elitist places. They hardly ever went into places like Soweto and things like that. I mean, it was odd, right? So I remember that being somewhat disconcerting when I first got there. I thought AGAG was a younger group of people who were wanting to put certain resources into Africa and wanted to see if they could build up the appetite for more resources going into Africa, which I thought was definitely what was needed, right? And they were knowledgeable about, they'd worked in the field, they had a better sense of what was going on the ground, they were less specialists and more sort of generalists. And I thought that was an interesting mix. So I was quite happy to see AGAG come along, and I think I served on the board initially, right? Didn't I?
Bill Moses, who was part of the group who organized AGAG, describes the new context.
One of the things that was happening at that moment as well was that many of the funders who'd been in South Africa in the anti-apartheid struggle were beginning to pull away. And the idea was that we needed to be more relevant to the new world we were seeing at the time. And so a group of younger program officers at the time, Nancy Muirhead, me, Andrea Johnson, and Nancy Muirhead was from Rockefeller Brothers, and Andrea Johnson was from the Carnegie Corporation, and a few other program officers decided that it would be a good idea to think about rethinking SAGAG into something that was more continent-based and continental.
Andrea Johnson, who was also part of the core group that organized AGAG, describes how changing American Foundation interest in Africa influenced its formation.
I think what we benefited from was the fact that most of the other affinity groups that were existing at the time offered nothing to people who were internationally focused, much less focused on Africa. They were looking for community of some kind. They were happy that somebody was talking about the part of the world where they were working. which is, of course, very different from working in the United States.
Nancy Muirhead, who also played a central role in AGAG's formation, reflects on how the optimism of the post-apartheid period motivated this new undertaking.
At the time, there was a desire to have a networking organization to promote ongoing learning and to share information and knowledge, because it's lonely when you're a program officer or director. You're usually the only person, or often, sometimes, like I was the only person working on South Africa at the time at the RBF. No one else knew anything about South Africa. So my closest colleagues were at other foundations. Apartheid had just fallen, and that there was such hope, and people thought it was a model for the world and that everything could change. It was like a tremendous opportunity to be working in South Africa right after the apartheid fell. That was like unbelievable. So that was a tight network. And of course, it's also nice to have the opportunity to share notes, share experiences, problem solve, and also just to be a service to the field. That was actually another key motivating factor for AGAG, was to make it easier for foundations to fund in Africa. Because when you looked at international grant making at the time, it was minuscule what went to Africa as opposed to other parts of the world. And we wanted to change that to try to help motivate other donors. So that was a big part of it, actually.
Karen Colvard, who attended several of SAGAG's meetings, reflects on AGAG's emergence.
A lot of us were interested in different places in Africa and felt that the real action was something was elsewhere, or at least was also elsewhere. I was glad to hear when AGAG was being formed, it seemed like there were a lot of new, fresh ideas and leaving some of the old perspectives behind that I think had served their course.
AGAG formally established itself in 2000 as a project of the Tade Center, an incubator for progressive and social justice initiatives based in San Francisco. Fittingly, its first official meeting was held at the prestigious Pocantico Conference Center in Tarrytown, New York. The meeting reflected how seriously this group was approaching this new initiative that included both new and established foundations and grant-making public charities. A core group, Ford, Hewlett, Kellogg, MacArthur, Mott, Packard, Rockefeller, United Nations Foundations, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund all provided startup support. The setting and conversations signaled that this was the beginning of a very special undertaking. Dan Robbins, who managed a family trust funding in Zimbabwe, remembers the atmosphere at the Pocantico meeting.
I'll always remember the meeting up in the estate where we met. It was an extremely formative gathering and sharing of experience. We really catalyzed a much healthier and broader approach from the outset that I think would have taken a long time to have achieved by personal experience. And so it really allowed me to land on the ground, at least looking the right direction.
Geography was this group's common interest, but they were also very diverse with different funding levels, approaches, and experiences. Their interests ranged from reproductive health, environment, and education to microenterprise, social justice, and population, to name a few. The group formed a steering committee, but they all had full-time jobs that required frequent travel. Bill Moses, who was the initial co-chair, describes how the next task became apparent: hire someone who could devote the time to grow and manage this new network.
To tell you, it was just too exhausting. I mean, because you had to make the cookies, and you had to invite people, and you had to find the room, and you had to set the agenda, and you had to talk to 5 people to figure out if you should meet. It was pretty informal. There was a fair amount of turnover because people would have an interest and then things would shift. And so it was difficult to do that. We didn't also want it to be based at a single foundation, because inevitably what would happen is it would then become the agenda of that foundation. I think that was part of it. The other part of it was that we thought we might be more effective if we could have professional leadership to keep us focused on the work and be the backbone of the work over time? Could we hire someone to watch over AGAG who shares our passion and support of the continent? And so in September of 2001, we had a search, and that's where we ended up finding you, Niamani.
The group found professional leadership and both knowledge about and commitment to Africa in Niamani Mutima. She reflects on her impression of the newly formed group, where her stewardship would span the next 2 decades.
I think the central thing was that you had this group that wanted to do something more than just run into each other at the local expat bar when they were in the country and depend upon ad hoc opportunities to get together. It was a much broader group of folks who were involved in funding in South Africa. And this was very much influenced by the Trans-Africa focus on divestment and anti-apartheid. So you had a lot of people and organizations who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement that were not necessarily funders. So I think that was kind of the context. It was a much broader group. And I think, too, that it was part of a feeling that it had been a valuable gathering point to understand what was going on, to understand more about context. And I think that particular group felt it was very important for funders who were funding to understand context. It was also influenced by an attitude that people had about South Africa, that once apartheid was ended, that South Africa, it was referred to as the linchpin of the continent. So I think there was also this attitude that this was going to be a very significant event for the entire continent and not just for the Southern Africa region. I'm not sure if they even thought that 20 years later, it would still be around.
AGAG's formation was taking place against the backdrop of significant global events that would impact the continent and community at the center of its work. African communities were hit hard by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, especially children. The rapid spread and high mortality rates added to its devastation. Caring for the growing number of orphans who had lost parents and caregivers was a major concern. Despite the popular trend to fund orphanages in Africa, some funders pushed back on this notion that had long since been abandoned in America. Jennifer Astone, who at the time worked for a family foundation that focused on children. She reflects on the importance of community and extended family in caring for those who were affected by AIDS.
It's really hard to dial back to that time. Triple therapy and AZT had just come on to the scene at this time, and it was not widespread. And certainly there was very little to no treatment on the continent. And I remember one of our board members, Natasha Martin, who is now passed, is a research chemist that worked on HIV and AIDS in infants. And she was part of the team that identified HIV in a pediatric transmission. And this was a huge issue on the continent at the time. There were maybe not so many foundations that were working in this area. A lot of public institutions were thinking about it. And Firelight really decided to focus their energies on community-based responses to HIV and AIDS. And this was also at a time when many religious institutions were focused on responses where they were setting up orphanages. So there were other players that were involved. This is the early 2000s. We really believe that if African communities and families, particularly extended families, had the resources necessary, they can and could and should be taking care of the children. And for a variety of reasons, one of the most critical and important ones is maintaining connection to culture and place.
While some of the foundations represented in the group were funding AIDS-related work, many hadn't developed a strategy for incorporating it into their funding interests. But there was a clear understanding that regardless of what you were funding in Africa, HIV/AIDS was an important consideration. Niamani recalls the different opinions about how to respond to HIV/AIDS and how shifts in funders' approaches caused many groups that retained an exclusive focus on AIDS to scramble for continued support.
AIDS dominated a lot of our discussions early on. And so you also had people who were working with the groups that were really being impacted by HIV/AIDS, who I think were really seeing the devastation firsthand. But then you also had people who were working at a higher level who also saw the need for policy. Do you do a Band-Aid now, or do you look at some bigger problems? So HIV/AIDS for several years was the focus. And then at one point, the funding community decided instead of funding AIDS as a distinct thing, it should be integrated. And so you had a shift in terms of where the interest was.
The 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security brought new attention on funding to organizations based outside of the United States. International philanthropy faced added layers of scrutiny. It was important to demonstrate that funding was not benefiting anyone connected to terrorist activities. Nancy Muirhead, who served as co-chair of AGAG, recalls interviewing Niamani Mutima in New York on the day after the attacks and the event's impact on the group's resolve to move forward with AGAG's formation.
We interviewed you, I think it was September 12th, the day after, right? September 11th gave it a sense of urgency. You kick into sort of survival mode. And so focusing on interviewing you and moving ahead with something really constructive that could make a difference in the world was a comfort, I think, to everybody. You know, like I felt a compulsion to continue working on this project that we had planned and that we were so excited about and that would make a difference. We weren't going to like give up and say, we're not going to engage with the world now after this had happened, but we have to move ahead. But part of it was like a personal thing of like fear, because at that time it was, you remember, it was a very scary time to be in New York City. But then also I think it was just because it was such a positive thing and it was a collegial effort where we could be constructive and make a difference in the world. So we were even more committed because of that, I think.
Soon after the attacks, President Bush issued an executive order blocking the assets of anyone supporting terrorists. And what supporting could mean was quite broadly defined and applied to charitable contributions. These and other regulations put international grantmakers on notice. In this new era of heightened scrutiny, the impact of 9/11 on international philanthropy would prove to be long-lasting. It was against this backdrop of global events that the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group began to take shape, building a professional community and defining its niche. Joyce Malombe, known for her expertise in education and community philanthropy in Africa, describes how AGAG's work made important contributions to the sector.
I think maybe AGAG brought to the table the context, African context. It's different. What has happened is that its relevance and the way it positioned was being influenced by the landscape. As the landscape was changed, AGAG was saying what to be done here.
Tade Aina, who held senior positions with a range of foundations and civil society organizations, reflects on the dynamics within American philanthropy when AGAG was emerging and its influence on African philanthropy.
AGAG came out at a time when some of the U.S. foundations saw the importance of helping to build strong philanthropies and philanthropic networks and infrastructures outside of the U.S. themselves. I think there was a significant recognition there about the fact that philanthropy matters, but philanthropy with a kind of mission, a kind of engagement, some kinds of value systems in terms of the recognition of partnerships and co-creation, and some kinds of understanding of the recipient of the gifts of philanthropy as a partner and as somebody with some degree of equality in the relationship. That's been a long walk, to quote Nelson Mandela. But that was the beginning of that significant positioning. And it's amazing because as AGAG was growing and bringing together U.S. foundations. It was also engaging emerging philanthropies. And I say that carefully and with a lot of caution, because you cannot say networks of giving that have existed for years emerging philanthropies. They are actually alternative modes of philanthropic engagement and giving. So it came at that time. AGAG had an interesting role at the beginning, almost indirect, because I'm speaking from the perspective of having been located in the Ford Foundation at that time, with the African Philanthropy Initiative, with the Global Philanthropy Initiative, with the beginning of the Community Foundations Initiative. All of that period of the seeding, and I use the word seeding, not yet flowering, which was almost the same way because the seed grew into flowers very quickly, of the philanthropic endeavor and the philanthropic mission and the struggle to understand what that meant. I think that particular moment was important, and that many people might not recognize it. Today we talk about decolonizing philanthropies. I think that platform and the struggle to begin that journey was very significant.
AGAG was housed in the Rockefeller Brothers Fund offices in Midtown Manhattan until 2008, but it formed its own identity and reputation. The combined efforts of the steering committee and Niamani's leadership helped to shape AGAG into a space where people felt welcomed, valued, and seen. Buise Wasidzumo has worked for American foundations with offices in Johannesburg. She also chaired the AGAG steering committee. She describes the atmosphere within the professional community that AGAG created.
And I must say that, it's really been a positive experience, largely, I think, because of you, Niamani, and how you've kind of curated, I don't know if curate is the word, but just how you've made that space to be where all views are valued equally. So I didn't feel that as a newcomer to the steering committee that I was less valued than people who have been there from the beginning. And it's not about assimilation either, because sometimes you feel the pressure to assimilate once you get into a space where people have already crafted and been comfortable with each other. But I found that people were open to hearing differing views, so I didn't, sometimes you feel odd when you say things that are a bit uncomfortable and where you feel that you're saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear. I must say that you and the colleagues created that space in such a way that it became normal and okay to have different views with each other because there was always respectful engagement.
The African philanthropy sector was gaining momentum. Organizations such as the African Women's Development Fund, Trust Africa, the East Africa Grantmakers Network, and the African Grantmakers Network, all based in Africa, were becoming the cornerstones of the African philanthropy sector. Several of the funders became members of AGAG. Those leading the philanthropy networks were frequent guest speakers at the annual meeting. Building relationships with the African philanthropy sector became an important part of AGAG's work. It served as a bridge that helped to build global connections. The annual conference became an important meeting place. It provided rare opportunities for people who were not likely to meet each other to get to know each other. Rules of engagement framed the discussions, designed to build community and dissipate the different power dynamics and tensions. There were several. Between those with large and modest budgets, between those with endowed funds and those who raised money to make grants, and between those based in higher and lower income countries. There were also differences in opinion about approaches. Some supported service delivery, others public goods or advocacy. Some had strong opinions about funding grassroots and community organizations. Others felt supporting academic, medical, and research institutions or influencing public policy had a greater impact. Niamani Mutima, AGAG's executive director, describes how the ground rules she developed and consistently reinforced were part of her strategy to create a safe space for the diverse and changing group of people, and to operationalize the principles of equity and respect.
I had some ground rules that I said, okay, if we're going to make this community. So one ground rule is that this is an equal playing field. So it doesn't matter how much money you fund, that knowledge has nothing to do with money. If you're sitting beside your program officer, because you're grant making public charity, you're wearing your grant maker hat. The assumption was that Africa was not broken. So there was always this tension of what we were building and the framework that we were building and the culture that we were building, and people who had been coming to the annual conference every year and got to know each other, and then new people who came in who perhaps came from a different perspective. And I mean, there were some very heated debates and discussions, but the other thing we tried to do was to create a safe space. So we didn't allow press. What was said in the discussion stayed in the discussion.
Joyce Malombe shares the role she felt AGAG played in the ongoing conversations about philanthropy in the African context.
And for me, AGAG opened the space for this conversation about philanthropy in other contexts, especially Africa, and what it actually means, and really opened up space for people themselves to say what they think it means and whether it means anything to them. So it's not just about money. It is more than money. And it sounded like to me, with time, we started to realize there's also social capital. There's also relationships. There are linkages. And AGAG started to leverage those linkages and connect them and just support people to figure out what is it they are talking about.
Sarah Mukasa has worked with both an African Women's Fund and an American foundation. She reflects on how AGAG's level playing fields supported building peer relationships.
I mean, for us, it was a really useful space because we had all of these key philanthropy, I think it's Ford Foundation, Carnegie. OSF was even there long before I joined OSF. And a few other sort of leading philanthropies. And for the first time, we were sitting with these people as peers. We were sitting with these people as peers and not as recipients of grants, right? Which was a totally new dynamic. And we were exchanging on that basis. That there was some critical reflection for philanthropy itself, to say, we need to change, and change doesn't happen overnight. It hasn't happened overnight, but I think those conversations, of course, they contributed to it. Of course, I think they did. Yeah.
Different perspectives often sparked spirited conversations. One such exchange was about per diems. Per diem is the term for the daily allowance for work-related travel and meals. These costs were often included in grants, and the organizations that received grants are called grantees or grantee partners. Yvonne Moore, who works with foundations and private donors, and Vuyiswa Sidzumo, who is based in South Africa, both recall their reactions to this discussion and how it revealed issues about power and class.
That was the conference in Philadelphia, outside of Philly. And it was really what I understand now to be a conversation around, perceptions of class and privilege. But it was a conversation around per diems. But, as I think about that deeper, it was really a class and a power issue so deep. So we were actually having, and this time we were actually having a blown out, it was a bit of a debate. It was a bit of an argument. About providing per diems to our grantee partners. And ironically, a lot of my African colleagues in the room had a problem with per diems. But, there's also a language issue I also now understand is how do we talk about giving our grantee partners what they need in order to navigate the world in a way that is respectful and dignified. And the thing that I found most interesting was that every single person in that room was actually using their expense account at work. But that never once came up. And so these really complicated conversations that, again, actually help you to learn and think and pull apart and what people would say unpack.
Buiswa reflects on how this and other discussions influenced her, at times affirming and at other times challenging her own perspectives.
I have shifted in my own thinking. I'll make another funny example. It was, I think, during a meeting in Philadelphia, and we were talking about per diems for grantees or participants in your programs. And I remember Yvonne getting up so angry and about people, this firstly being still a discussion, and just how disrespectful it is that with nickel and dime grantees, when we are carrying credit cards that have no limit to how much we can pay for dinner, and because sometimes you sit and you think to yourself, this is wrong, but I don't know how to articulate it. So Yvonne's, outburst, to put it nicely, really liberated me, because I was like, whew, then I'm not crazy. I'm not just a weird person who thinks that this is the right moral thing to do, and so on. So also it helped in that sense of kind of affirming my own ways of thinking, or sometimes challenging my own ways of thinking because of listening to how others are doing things. So without a doubt, I've benefited greatly from being in this space.
Little public information was available about the trends in private funding targeting Africa. AGAG's research agenda was shaped by the questions that emerged. The reports AGAG published in 2004 and 2007 highlighted that the majority of funding went to international NGOs headquartered in the United States. Most of the local and country organizations who did the actual work only received project funding, which seldom covered general operating costs. The information that AGAG curated and the research it produced made significant contributions to the sector, raising questions early on about grant-making practices and policies. In some instances, AGAG's research encouraged a change in approach. Andrea Johnson reflects on the influence of AGAG's research on the sector.
In the way that sort of we've talked about Africa, and the way that we've talked about funding in Africa has perhaps been a little bit ahead of the curve. We don't make as much noise as others do, but when I look back, and especially now, everybody is talking about, how much of the grant making goes to African headquartered organizations. And I just want to say, we were there. We were talking about this years ago, and now it's a big thing. And so in that way, I think just, some of the sort of compilations, the research that was done, it really did yield some sort of prescient findings, things that are now considered important. One of the most striking moments for me was when the findings of the sort of youth support in Southern Africa, the health and education support, when those findings were presented at a retreat and people saw the disparity between how much money was going to institutions that were based outside of Africa, but the work was going on in Africa, and how much of the money was going to organizations that were indigenously African. And that generated so much discussion, and it led us to further research in that area. And it also led us at Carnegie in our most recent data report to make sure that the analysis included that, because it is important. So, but I think, that was something, can't say that it was AGAG necessarily that started that conversation, but certainly we were there and got there before I think some others did.
The research explored more than money. One study explored how organizations received funding, including using intermediaries, a term used to describe organizations that receive funding to regrant to other organizations. Sarah Mukasa remembers discussing these practices, but with a different understanding about its implications and significance in the African philanthropy sector.
I remember at the time the notion of African philanthropic organizations acting as intermediaries for funds from the North, which was a politically loaded term where we were coming from, because it suggested, at least to us, we had been used to that term in development practice. We had been used to that term, and it had very much traditionally in Africa referred to conduits who did but didn't think, had no agency, didn't think, right? It suggested certain power differentials in power and resource distribution and allocation, and therefore in decisions about, what the agenda was, whose voice was reflected in the agenda, and so on. But in fairness to AGAG, I mean, and I think that went on, that did go on for a while. But I think in fairness to AGAG was one of those networks that was willing to sort of listen and examine and sort of formulate a new language around these relationships that was less that was more equitable. And quite frankly, I mean, when we look back now with the lenses of, the intersections of race and gender, and, I mean, we really wanted, looking back now, we really wanted a space that recognized Africa's contribution and that recognized Africa as, equal partners. And I think AGAG went out of its way to do that. AGAG's members, at least we dialogued. At least we dialogued.
Stephen Lawrence, author and research expert on trends in American philanthropy, comments on AGAG's research agenda.
What's been important about AGAG's work is that the research didn't stop there. You then commissioned additional research to dig deeper into, well, why are U.S. funders focusing so much on intermediaries versus focusing on organizations headquartered in various African communities? Which is a good question. And it's not to say that there's an either or, it should all be one or all be the other, but it's to understand, well, are the assumptions that are guiding the decisions that are being made about where to focus funding, in fact, based on the reality in Africa? I think that's been a tremendous opportunity to basically challenge anecdote, challenge assumptions with some grounded factual data, and to find ways to consistently share that information at convenings, through webinars, through other resources, so that this is constantly being reinforced.
AGAG's annual meeting became its signature event and developed a reputation as a space where people were challenged to reflect upon their work and view it in different ways. The people and discussions mirrored the changing landscapes in philanthropy and across Africa. Its diversity was also a rare chance to meet colleagues and have conversations you were not likely to encounter elsewhere. In his interview, Kyerematin reflected on his experience as part of the AGAG community.
With the members that I have interacted with, generally speaking, it struck me that they all tend to, regardless of whether they're based outside the continent or on the continent, appreciate the need and embrace this trend of empowering philanthropy within Africa. But I'm not sure that I would have had the opportunity to meet the folks that I've met through AGAG any other way. Maybe if I was part of several other networks, that might be possible, but I've not interacted with them in any other forum. And so in terms of value, I definitely will say it does have value, because the role that it plays in convening funders is important. That space is important. Now, what we do with that space is another thing.
Despite the challenges of the diversity of interests, approaches, and experiences within the group, over the years, AGAG carved an important niche for itself. Victoria Dunning, who was a member of the steering committee during AGAG's early years, comments on the critical role it has played.
A critical thing that AGAG can offer and has offered is the ability to learn together and help shape that dialogue, because there is commonality, and I think it allows for greater influence of each other and peer learning, peer sharing, peer mentoring and influence. And I think despite the heterogeneity at all of those levels, the funders, the continent, and approaches, etc., AGAG has a critical role and has played that quite well of finding the common threads and joining together for learning.
AGAG earned its reputation as a space where the discussions were grounded in fundamental and probing questions about grant-making policies and the realities of working in the sector. Raoul Davion, who also served on the steering committee and has worked with foundations and nonprofit organizations, comments on what AGAG offered program staff.
I think the other piece, which is certainly also part of the Africa Grantmakers experience, is just kind of the craziness of being in the philanthropic sector in general and all of the challenges that one is presented with as a member of an organization that is trying to make change from afar, and some of the disconnects that I think we grappled with between ourselves as maybe more program staff and leadership, and being able to use the Grantmakers, Africa Grantmakers as a professional community to think through or just unload around those issues was a huge benefit.
Marcia Thomas, who manages a fund established by American artists to support community and grassroots organizations in Africa, comments on how understanding Niamani's leadership shaped her understanding of AGAG.
I really have a hard time separating you from AGAG. So from the point of view is that my understanding of your role as the head of AGAG played a big role in my understanding of AGAG. My sense of orientation of you, that I had a greater appreciation for AGAG, because you were presenting things where you would ask the hard questions, from the donors, the funders, or in the working groups or the little groups, you could always ask them, well, why did you decide to do this that way? And what's been your experience with possibly having a different approach being applied to support you were providing? And most importantly, in terms of assessing the impact of organizations, what parameters are you using? Are you using the ones that are based solely from this side, or do you have any sense of impact identification from the other side? Because Africans may have a different sense of something that's considered to be impactful, but it may not necessarily meet the standard that is required for when you return in your monitoring and evaluation reports. And I can honestly say over the years, I could see how some of the language that people were using in those group discussions were changing.
Mamo Mohapi, who has worked with an American foundation based in South Africa, talks about the network's role in connecting practitioners.
What I see as AGAG's niche actually has been connecting philanthropy professionals and practitioners that are looking at supporting philanthropy in the continent. I think, the emphasis on the individuals and the professionals for me has been something that I have not quite seen in any of the other philanthropy networks that I've been in. And the fact that there's always been intent, I've always had this feeling that when I'm in that space, what's really valued is my view as a philanthropy practitioner who is doing grant making in the continent rather than somebody who is working for a particular foundation. So I think for me, the niche has really been, kind of the focus and the emphasis on the individuals and the practitioners themselves, and connecting that to a very specific focus of grant making in Africa. I think for me that combination is quite unique in a sense for AGAG. Yeah.
Niamani Mutima describes how she approached her role in leading the network.
My role, I felt, was to try to demystify Africa, to get people to stop talking about Africa as if it was some kind of abstract concept. So we moved from servicing funders to servicing African communities. And the reason why we said African communities is because communities are people. So to also reinforce that, when I talk to not only members of AGAG, but any funder who's funding, particularly those funding African communities, as well as the NGO leaders and the journalists and all the other development practitioners, just all the people who are involved in the sector. So my role is to be a sponge and to absorb all of that. And my role is also to be a generalist because I've got such a diverse group that's there. And so in putting together the annual conferences, the tension was always, how do you focus on issues that people are interested in, but also focus on issues that people should be interested in, that maybe they aren't? So how do you put things on people's radar that is not there, that should be there? And to also talk about what the implications are for that particular thing to grant-making practices as a whole. So I'm always trying to extract from the particular the application to the general as far as grant-making practices are concerned.
Chris Allen, whose work included donors and civil society organizations, shares how he viewed AGAG's work.
Over the years, as AGAG, I think, got a little more established, and watching people think, okay, it's no longer enough that we're doing grant making in Africa. Now, are we doing good grant making in Africa? And what does that look like? And people wrestling with principles, people wrestling with practices. And we were still all over the map. You had people doing completely different kind of things, but looking at people grappling more and more with, the how you do it sometimes matters as much as the what. And it was nice to watch. I kind of follow the trend through the years of taking that seriously and creating opportunities or platforms for people to deal with it. Because I'm always talking, it was not African Grant-Making Association, it was Africa Grant-Making, because the majority of us weren't or haven't been Africans, which is an important thing never, ever to forget, I think.
The conversations were changing, and philanthropy was changing as well. Nancy Muirhead reflects on how, during its early years, AGAG's leadership reflected the lack of diversity within the philanthropy sector at large, and the positive impact of changes that have taken place over the years.
It was 2001 when this started, so early 2000. So at the time, the leadership were all white people. I think at the time, certainly Bill and Andrea and I don't remember who else was on the steering committee, but I would say at the time, the field of philanthropy in the United States was more dominated by white people than it is now. It's much more diverse now. So the field in general has become much more inclusive, which is a great thing. So I think AGAG over the years has evolved, and there's been many new grant makers, and there's been more grant foundations that have been better with their hiring in terms of finding people that are representative of all parts of our society, et cetera. But I think the field has really changed for the better, and that AGAG has evolved with that and brought in, which we always want to do, younger people, training in the next generation of philanthropic leaders, et cetera. And hopefully that's a more diverse group of people.
Jennifer Astone recalls that the increase in hiring more African program officers also helped to surface issues of racism and privilege, topics that needed to be broached.
we were in a period, and I remember this really distinctly, where more foundations were hiring Africans as their program officers. And I think it was a wonderful link. Now we're seeing more foundations actually have program officers and offices in Africa that are run by Africans, right? And so I just think that the participation of Africans as program officers really created on-ramps for discussions that probably would not have happened otherwise. And I'm sure there are moments when they were freaking out because of the way people talked in the room. I won't say that there isn't racism among the program officers, and just sort of a sense of privilege that we, that we bring. I bring as a white person. Like, I'll just, I own it.
Joyce Wasidzumo, who is based in South Africa working for an American foundation, remembers a comment that highlighted how attitudes about Africa can influence grant-making strategies, and not always for the better.
You know my famous quote, my first meeting of AGAG, where somebody just said very flippantly, "Oh, you know how Africans are." And in my head, I was like, oh my word, all 54 countries, we just summarized in that one sentence. And I, I kind of, it was then that I decided that I would keep coming back, because I, at times, felt that Africa may not be viewed as favorably or as appropriately as it should, and that it needed people like us who are Africans based in Africa to sometimes correct those perceptions. Because my fear was that if then people hold those kinds of views and perceptions, then I worried about the types of decision making that accompanies their giving on the continent. So even if I kind of was in a conversation where I could set the record straight right away or something like that, I can't say I was fully successful there and that I spoke to everyone. But just being in a space that, I think by and large, it's a friendly group. It was a friendly group of people, that were open to hearing other viewpoints. And which is what I think also then enabled the opening of the space, so that over time, as AGAG then began to invite people from the continent to make inputs, I think it then became even more real because people were hearing directly from people implementing the kinds of programs that they are supporting on the continent. And so they could get firsthand information about, topical issues.
The increase in African program staff, funders, and philanthropy networks in Africa influenced AGAG's evolution. AGAG redefined its mission from serving funders to promoting philanthropy benefiting African communities. This subtle change foreshadowed another significant shift. In 2008, AGAG broke tradition and held its annual convening in Johannesburg, South Africa. The Johannesburg meeting proved to be an important milestone and had a different atmosphere. The African philanthropy sector was well represented. Over a quarter of those attending represented community, corporate, and private grantmakers that were headquartered on the African continent. Nicolette Naylor remembers attending the meeting as a new program officer and its impact on her and other program staff based on the continent.
My first AGAG meeting in Joburg literally blew my mind. I remembered the piece about seeing African experts, because there was always these white American experts on Africa. And I sat there thinking, so I can be an expert and my colleagues can be experts, because wow, look at that. There was that opening session that was literally everyone was sitting forward in their seats, and all of us program officers based on the continent that were in that meeting, based in US institutions where we were constantly hearing from other people telling us about Africa. and the fact that you had African funders, and we had a conversation about African philanthropy. So this is really, you were ahead of your time in terms of saying, if we were going to be there, we need to have this kind of panel. Everyone does that now, not in that time. I learned more in that meeting than I'd learned up until that point. The AGAG meeting, when I attended, I was like, there are all these people working here. They have expertise, and they're speaking about how philanthropy responds to the African context. It resonated, it made sense, and they were speaking almost like in a language that I understood. What made that meeting so powerful is because I'd done orientation in New York. And it seemed like this U.S. entity and all these U.S. people came to talk to us about Ford Foundation, what we do, how you write a grant. It was very transactional. It wasn't about relationships. It didn't mention Africa really. And there were all of us sitting in a room doing this group orientation from around the world. And when I got back to the South Africa office, I was like, so how the hell do I do all of this in this context?
The Johannesburg meeting elevated AGAG's profile, expanded its reach, and helped to forge relationships with members of the African philanthropy sector. All of these factors helped to shape its responses to the changing environment. It foreshadowed AGAG's next phase of proactively serving as a bridge to connect those working to leverage philanthropic resources to benefit African communities. Joyce Malombe summarizes the AGAG process.
We are looking for a path. We may not be able all to package it in one place, but we are opening the space so that we can figure it out as we move along and as we try and see how it impacts Africa.
Akwasi Aidoo, who served as AGAG's co-chair and in key roles in American and African philanthropy sectors and with civil society organizations, characterizes AGAG's evolution and impact.
AGAG also always looking, and that diverse membership in terms of geographic and thematic areas. Geographic and thematic diversity meant that consciously and subconsciously, we were always within the context of AGAG, looking for the ties that bind. And the ties that bind are not necessarily thematic nor geographic. They are things that come from curating, from information, from lessons learned, from looking into the future, looking at trends that could impact the grant making going forward, all of which are really embodied in the AGAG membership and processes and discussions. Really brings to the table what I'll call a process of making a forest out of the trees.
There is no doubt that these practitioners not only influenced each other, but also influenced the policies and practices of a wide range of grant-making organizations. For over 2 decades, AGAG welcomed new and experienced practitioners as it responded to the changing landscapes. It has been characterized as a safe space and a political and intellectual home by those who have been a part of its evolution. Thank you for listening. We also want to thank those who shared their thoughts and memories. The interviews in this series were conducted by Niamani Mutima, and the interviews with Niamani were taken from conversations with Stephen Lawrence. To learn more about the people who participated in these interviews and the AGAG Legacy Project, please see the program notes. This episode was produced by Talea Grimes of T-Muse Media and Niamani Mutima. AGAG is fiscally sponsored by Tide Center, a non-profit organization.